I've mentioned several times in preaching recently and in teaching classes, in discussions that we've had concerning the providence of God, the book of Esther. And I decided this evening that we're going to spend our time in that book, and we're not looking at any other passages other than confined to this book. If you've ever read the book, it's really a very short book. It wouldn't take long to read it all, really. It's only 10 chapters long, and some of the chapters are very short, one having only 3 verses. But it's interesting to look at this book, because I've been asking in Bible class many times questions to the effect of what is providence? What are you talking about when you talk about the providence of God? Well, roughly I would define providence as being God bringing His will to pass without direct intervention or a miraculous act. I noticed that Leon in his prayer just mentioned the fact that God is in control. We believe that, even though we believe that we do not live in a miraculous age. Therefore, we would look at God as exercising His will through the providence. Now, one of the problems that we have at the present time sometimes is that people will attribute providence to practically everything. And the trouble that we have is that determining what is a providential act of God and what is time and chance, as Solomon speaks of it in his book of Ecclesiastes, time and chance happen to us all. It's rather difficult. And since God has not told us, then we really don't know specifically. But I think if you're like me, and you're a person who has a great deal of faith in God, you look at events that some people think of as being coincidental, and you kind of think, that looks like that might have been the hand of God. Now, you don't have any way to prove that or to demonstrate that, but if you have the confidence that God does rule in the affairs of men and can bring all things together to good for those that love the Lord, then you have to believe that whether you can put your finger on it or not, that God can use a providential act, and does, to affect our lives. Now, when you look at the book of Esther, to me, it is the best illustration. In fact, it's not one illustration. It's actually a whole group of illustrations of providential acts of God. One of the things you have to remember about this book, remember we said that providence is something that God effects without direct involvement or miraculous act. And as we've said many times and commented, in the book of Esther, God is never mentioned. He never mentioned in the book. It's like He's present in every page, but He's never mentioned in the book. So we're going to talk about this book. Before we do that, there are a couple of questions that we need to ask about it. One would be, what was the need going to be? In this particular case, something was going to happen that was going to lead to a situation that needed someone that was in a position to stand up for the people of God and deliver them from complete destruction and annihilation. That's what the need was going to be. And then another question would be this: how was one brought to that position? And that's what this book of Esther is all about. That's how one was brought to this position. One of the things that's really interesting is that in the 4th chapter of the book, a passage that we've read many times in verse 14, Mordecai, who was of course been her uncle, he said, "If thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall there enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place." In other words, he had confidence that in this position that the Jewish nation had been placed in, that God was going to deliver them. And he said, "You've been the one, I believe," he was saying, chosen to do this, but if you choose not to do it, then God is not limited. God will choose deliverance from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth? And this is the key. Who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? I think Mordecai is saying what we've already said in the last few minutes. When you think of the providence of God, you can't put your finger on it. You really can't. You can't say, okay, that's the providence of God, because God didn't reveal it to you. And the secret things belong to the Lord. They don't belong to us. Only those things that are revealed do. And so Mordecai seems to be saying, we have to act in a way that allows God to use us if He so chooses. And that basically is what he's saying, and I think that's something that all of us certainly need to be aware of. Who knows whether you came to this position for such a time as this? Sometimes you hear people say, oh, he was put there by God. Well, you know, that's a stretch for us to just say that offhand without proof. But on the other hand, we can have confidence that God does, in some way, rule in the affairs of men, and consequently brings about His will. Now, let's kind of think about it for a few moments. I start in chapter 1, and I want to look at several things. One of the things that's interesting here is that God begins to solve the problem before the problem arises. You ever notice that? I mean, the problem at the time that God begins to solve the problem in putting Esther in a position of power and authority, the problem has not yet arisen. It doesn't arise until later. But God is in the process of solving a problem that does not yet exist, which is kind of an interesting thing within itself. The problem is that for Esther to be able to do what she did, to be brought to the kingdom for such a time as this, is stated in chapter 4 and verse 14, there was a little bit of a problem. And the problem was a woman by the name of Vashti, because she was the queen. She was the queen of the Medo-Persian Empire at this particular time, the wife of Ahasuerus. And she's in a position that Esther is later going to occupy to solve the problem with the people of God. But at this time, she's in that position. So when you begin reading there in verse 11 of chapter 1, you see how she was removed. You say, did God have a hand in this? Well, whether or not you're going to say it or not, you seem to be looking at a book that is expressing that God is guiding things to bring about a particular result. And in this case, Vashti is the queen, and they're involved in a drunken party. The king has all the males over here, and they're getting drunk, and the queen has all the females over here, and I don't know if they're actually involved in a drunkenness or not, but they're having a feast while all these men are getting drunk, and they are pretty well intoxicated. And so the king sends word to his people to bring Vashti, the queen, before the king with the royal crown to show the people and the princes her beauty, for she was fair to look on. Now, it's kind of difficult to know exactly what he's talking about there. There are scholars who believe that the language of this book suggests that he wanted to come and pose nude, that she was so beautiful he wanted to show her off. I don't know if that's true or not. But whatever the situation was, she was, according to the record, a beautiful woman that he was proud of, and she was a trophy wife, and he was going to show off his trophy. But the queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore was the king very wroth, and his anger burned in him. She wasn't going to be shown in the way that he desired it to be. So the king said to the wise men, which knew the times, and so was the king's manner toward all that knew law and judgment, and the next unto him, and he names them, what shall we do unto the queen Vashti according to the law, because she hath not performed the commandment of the king Ahasuerus by the chamberlains? Now, Memucan answered before the king, and said, Vashti the queen hath not done wrong to the king only, but also to all the princes and to all the people that are in all the provinces of the king Ahasuerus. For this deed of the queen shall come abroad unto all women, that they shall despise their husbands in their eyes, when it shall be reported. And the king Ahasuerus commanded Vashti the queen to be brought in before him, but she came not. Likewise shall the ladies of Persia and Media say this day unto all the princes, king's princes, which have heard of the deed of the queen, thus shall there arise too much contempt and wrath. For if it please the king, let there go a royal commandment from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, that it be not as altered, that Vashti come no more before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal estate unto another that is better than she. So, if we're looking at this from the standpoint of what had to happen for Esther to be elevated to the position, and of course in this case, you're reading a record that's printed by inspiration about what happened, and whatever you want to say about it, God rules in the affairs of men to bring about His will, and in order for His will to be accomplished, she was removed. Now, I don't know how we can reach any other conclusion than that by reading the passage. And then, of course, immediately a search begins for a new queen. All right? The estate is vacated. There is no queen, and we're going to bring a new queen on the scene. And in verse 1 through 9, and we won't read it all necessarily, of chapter 2, after these things, when the wrath of King Ahasuerus was appeased, he remembered Vashti and what she had done, and the king's servants that ministered to him said, let there be fair virgins sought for the king. In other words, we're going to replace her. And let the maiden which pleaseth the king be queen instead of Vashti, in verse 4. And the thing pleased the king, and he did so. Now in Shushan the palace there was a certain Jew named Mordecai. And this man had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity which had been carried away from Jehoiakim, king of Judea, when Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. And he had brought up the woman that I have a hard time pronouncing the name, Hadassah, I guess. That is Esther, his uncle's daughter. And she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful. And I said uncle, but actually it would be cousin to be their relationship if I understand that correctly. And the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter. Evidently quite a bit older than her. And so you're introduced to this character, Mordecai, and he is the instrument through which Esther is brought before the king. Now, it's not stated here, but it's interesting to notice that he talks about when these people have been carried from Jerusalem with the captivity and been carried away with Jehoiakim the king. And you remember when they were carried away, and you have mentioned in the book of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, as we most often know them, that they were brought too. And because of where Mordecai was located at this time, you kind of suspect he was a part of that group. He was kind of the princes of Israel, and they were brought to kind of stand in the king's presence because Mordecai is constantly here before the king's gate. So he had some access to the king's folks, and that gave him the opportunity to bring Esther before the king. So it came to pass when the king's commandment and his decree were heard, and when many maidens were gathered together, Shushan the palace with the custody of Haggai, that Esther was brought also. And the maiden pleased him. He looked at her and thought, hey, this may be the one. She obtained kindness of him. He speedily gave her things of purification, such things belonged to her, and he gave her 7 maidens. And he preferred her and her maids unto the best place of the house of the women. Now, it's interesting to notice when you read this, it's like you're talking about a tight-knit web, and everything that happened was completely essential to every other thing that happened. And when people begin to think of providence, I sometimes wonder if God didn't give us this book for the express purpose of giving us some assurance that even though we don't have miraculous acts, and even though He's not directly involved, that things can be worked out so that He can, in fact, rule in the affairs of men. But Esther here, one of the things that's stated that also seems to be very important in this consideration, it was important. Esther had not shown her people nor her kindred. She didn't tell Haggai, she didn't tell Ahasuerus who she was. She didn't say she was a Jew. Now you may think, well, so what? Well, later that's going to become a very, very important point. Because you're going to be introduced to this man with the name of Haman. And then Haman is going to not know that she's a Jew. And he's going to kind of take her into his confidence and assume that she's going to assist him in the effort of destroying the Jews, not knowing that she herself was a Jew. So it's kind of interesting to read and to see what transpired in this particular case. Now, when you begin to think about this, Esther was then elevated to be queen. In chapter 3 and verse 6, chapter 2 and verse 16, I'm not used to looking at notes that I scribble out. So Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus unto his house in the 10th month, which is the month Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. And the king loved Esther above all women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins. So there he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti, which is a very important point, because this is what facilitates everything that happens, is that Esther becomes the queen. Now, later, you remember that Mordecai says to her, who knows but what you came to the kingdom for such a time as this? God has to have a deliverer. Now, so far, even up to this point, the problem that she's going to solve has not yet arisen, but it will. And so then we look in chapter 3 and verse 1, and Haman is mentioned. And it is stated that he is basically second in command in the kingdom. After these things did King Ahasuerus promote Haman and advanced him and set his seat above all the princes that were with him. So he was indeed the second in command in the kingdom. So I would suppose that if the king were incapacitated, that he would have the one that ruled. He would be the one that ruled. Now, that's very important, because Haman is elevated to this position. Now, Haman, when he is elevated to this position, he's a man of great ego, and he thinks a lot of himself. And so Haman wants all the people at the king's gate, that would be these dignitaries that are assembled around the gate, and Mordecai is one of them. He wants them all in verse 2 to bow down and reverence him. But Mordecai would not. And in verse 3, the king's servants came and asked Mordecai why he transgressed the king's commandment. And to make long matter short, he said at the end of verse 4, I'm a Jew, which seems to suggest that I'm not going to bow down and basically worship anybody, that I'm not going to do it. And it's a matter of conscience. All right. Now, so you've got Esther in the position as queen. You've got Mordecai at the gate, and he insults Haman, who's become the second in command in the kingdom. Now, we look at Haman, and he becomes very angry. And so what he decides to do, because Mordecai is a Jew, rather than just killing him, he says, in verse 6, he sought to destroy all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus, even the people of Mordecai. I kind of believe, and although all the facts are not revealed, but it's probably what he's thinking is, if you look back at history, the one nation that the Roman authorities had trouble with was the Jews. They had a hard time controlling them. Even when you look back to World War II and you see Hitler and he's trying to kill the Jews and sending them off to concentration camps and putting them in gas chambers and getting rid of them, if you've ever seen a movie or read the book about what happened at Warsaw, Poland, you understand he had a pretty tough time with that. It wasn't easy. The Jews were a rock in his shoe, and he hated them because of it. And here you have Haman, and it seems that he probably understood, hey, the reason this man's not bowing down and worshiping me is because he believes that there's one God, and he's only going to bow and worship him. I heard a policeman say in an interview the other day that he didn't bow before anyone other than God and nobody else. And that's kind of the way I think that Haman conducted himself. And so what you see is that Mordecai says, I'll just kill them all. I'm going to kill everyone. But obviously, he had to secure permission to do that, and the authority and the means. And that's what the rest of this is actually about. And so we see Haman, and he wants to kill them all. Well, Mordecai, in chapter 4 and verse 6, he comes to Esther after this takes place, and he says in this case that, hey, Mordecai is told of Haman's plan in verse 7, and he gave him the copy of the writing of the decree that he's going to destroy the Jewish people. And he gave it to him for the express purpose of being able to show that decree to Esther. In other words, he didn't just go in before Esther and say, hey, Haman's going to kill every Jew on the face of the earth. He went with a piece of paper that was an official document that Haman had put his seal on that said Haman was going to kill every Jew on the face of the earth. And when he goes and he tells her that, he's looking for help. Well, why? Because she's the queen. Well, why was she the queen? Who knows but whether God put you in such a position for such a time as this, he later says. So Esther, in this case, Mordecai goes to her and he seeks her help. But Esther is not overly anxious. She's asking her questions, and what she basically is saying is, there in verse 10, beginning, that, I can't just go in and have an audience with the king. I can't just walk in and talk to him. I mean, he's sitting in a place with guards, what we would call Secret Service, and they're all armed. And if anyone comes in before him uninvited, they look upon that as a threat and they'd kill him. And that would include me. And so I'm not going to be able to just walk in there. So she's not a real willing participant in the beginning. But that's when Mordecai comes up with those famous words. You know what? If you hold your peace, God will choose someone else. And who knows whether you were the one that was selected for such a time as this. And so, what we then find is Esther asked in verse 15 through 17, she told him to go back to Mordecai and tell them to gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan and fast for me. Now, there's no mention of God in this passage, and there's not even a mention of prayer. But you do realize that fasting and prayer are almost always directly connected in the Old Testament. It has to do with an appeal before God. It has to deal with an earnest appeal before God. And I think it's interesting to me that Esther, what she wanted was the support of the people as she was engaged in this particular mission. Somewhat like we would ask people, pray for me. And that's pretty much what she's doing in this case. And she then goes on to say this, and I also in my maids will fast likewise, and so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law. And she said something that you ought to really notice. She said, and if I perish, I perish. Do you remember what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said? If God wills, He can rescue us from this burning fiery furnace. In that case, He rescued them by miraculous direct action. In this case, He did not rescue her by direct action, by direct miraculous action, but rather by what I guess we would call providential care. But, she said, if I perish, I perish. She understood the risk involved. But she understood that there was something that needed to be done, and she undertook to do exactly what needed to be done in this particular case. Now, Esther had an ingenious plan. And her plan was that she would invite Haman, who was the second in command, and Ahasuerus, who was the king, her husband, to a feast. Just the two of them. And this was a little bit of an unusual situation. You think about this. This is a queen over the most powerful nation on earth at the time. And she says, not only do I want just the two of you to come, I'm going to prepare the meal and I'm going to serve the meal. She didn't want anybody there but them. That was it. Just those two people. Now here's the queen. She says, I'll prepare it and I will directly serve it. And just the two of you and me will be present. And so when you look down there in chapter 5, and you find that Esther has prepared the meal as she said that she would, then you go on and you look down and you see what happens here. In verse 14, Haman gets so excited. This is one of those things where it's like you see a movie and you're built up to a position that when somebody gets what's coming to them, you just celebrate. That's kind of what happens here. Haman gets so excited, he said, you know what? Goes home, tells all of his family. I've been invited to a feast and only 2 people are going to be there, the king and me. Now, that can only mean one thing. Esther likes me, and she's going to elevate me and help me up the ladder. And so his wife and his friends tell him, well, I'll tell you what you do. In verse 14, chapter 5. You make a gallows 50 cubits high. That would be 50 feet plus half again, 75 feet high. Make a gallows 75 feet high. You don't need a gallows 75 feet high to hang a man, but you do want to make a statement. And tomorrow, when you have this feast and you've got your audience with the king, you ask the king if you can hang Mordecai on that gallows. Now, that's important for you to remember when you think about the providence of God. Then you go thou in merrily with the king. In other words, you're going to hang him before the banquet. And the thing pleased Haman, and he caused the gallows to be made. Important that we notice that. But then in chapter 6, now everything you read here, I mean, just think about it. Think about the pieces of the puzzle that fit together as you weave together God bringing about what He wishes to bring about. Here's old Ahasuerus, and he has a sleepless night of all times. Mordecai's going to be hung the next day by Haman, and he's got to seek permission from the king to hang him first, but he has a sleepless night. And so he says, I'll tell you what, dude, bring me the book of records. In other words, just the official records of what took place, and I'll just and have it read for me. And so they did. And as they were reading in this official record, there was found written that Mordecai, now remember we didn't read about this, but back in the beginning, Mordecai had discovered a plot against the king to kill him. And he had gone to the keeper of the door, and he tells the king what was going on. And so the king then was rescued, and he executed these 2 men who were going to kill him. So the king had never really thought much more about that, I guess. I don't know if he ever knew it directly, but the king said, what honor and dignity hath been done to Mordecai for this? What have we done to honor him? And so the king's servants that ministered to him said, there's nothing done for him. We didn't ever do anything. He never received any reward for this great deed that he had done. Well, it's interesting that Haman goes then that morning to ask for permission to have Mordecai hanged, or to hang Mordecai in verse 4. Haman came into the outward court of the king's house to speak unto the king to hang Mordecai. At that time, as the king was involved in this conversation, he comes in and he's asking to hang Mordecai. Now just think of the irony of that. The king has just read, here's a man who saved my life by exposing a coup in which I would have been killed, and I want to honor him. And now this man comes in and says, I want to hang him. It's really interesting to notice what transpires. But, behold, Haman, the king's servant said unto him, Haman standeth in the court, and the king said, let him come in. Haman came in, and instead of just saying, let me hang Mordecai, here's what he said. The king addresses Haman first. What shall be done unto the man whom the king delighteth to honor? Now think about it. Haman's just been invited to this private dinner party between the king. That's just going to be, the king and his queen is going to be there, and Haman, and that's it. And then the king comes and asks this question. What should be done to a man whom the king delighteth to honor? Well, Haman thought, and I'm not guessing about this, Haman thought in his heart, to whom would the king delight to do honor more than myself? And so Haman answered the king, for the man whom the king delighteth to honor, let the royal apparel be brought, which the king useth to wear, and the horse that the king rideth upon, and the crown royal which is set upon his head. And let this apparel and horse be delivered to the hand of one of the king's most noble princes, that they may array the man with all whom the king delighteth to honor, and bring him on horseback through the street of the city, and proclaim before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delighteth in. And the king said to Haman, now notice it, who do you think the highest prince in the land was? It was Haman. And so Haman had just said, this is what ought to be done. So the king says, okay, you make haste, you go get the apparel, you get the horse, and you go get Mordecai. There's things in my life I would like to have seen. And this is one of them. I would have loved to have been there to see Haman standing there, just in anticipation of the king sending out and getting somebody and bringing them in and putting them on that horse and all that apparel and praising him and talking about how great a guy he was. And he turns to him and says, you go get Mordecai, the man you're wanting to hang. You came here. The king didn't know this at the time. You came here to ask permission to hang him, and now you're going to have to put him on a horse and ride him through the streets and proclaim what a great guy he is and how much he has prospered before the king. Now, you talk about providence. When people want a lesson in providence, I'm not sure that we can actually describe it, but this is probably the best lesson that I can think of that we can possibly teach. So he gets the great blessing that he thought that he was going to receive. He gets the privilege of putting that and doing that to the one that he came there to hang. Well, it's kind of interesting then. The king and Haman then go to the feast. He goes ahead and he does that, and he goes through the streets, and then he comes back, and they go to the banquet. He thought, his wife had said to him, if you go hang him, then you can go in and you can just be happy about the feast. But now I wonder what he thought about that feast. Well, things are going to get worse for poor old Haman, if you want to have any pity toward him. The king and Haman, they go to the feast in chapter 7. And the king and Haman came to the banquet. And the king said unto Esther on the second day of the banquet of wine, what is thy petition, Queen Esther, and it shall be granted thee? And Esther, the queen, answered and said, if I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. Now remember, she never told anybody who she was or what she was. But she goes on to say, for we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I had held my tongue, though the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. So the king Ahasuerus answered and said unto Esther, who is he? And where is he that durst presume in his heart to do so? And Esther said, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Now, would you like to be there to see that facial expression? Now, it's really interesting. You look at all that, and you think things can't get any worse. But they do. When you look down a little bit, down to in the reading in chapter 7, you look down there, and you find in verse 8 that Haman is here, and he comes into the bedroom, basically, of the queen. He follows her in there because the king's got mad, and he goes out, and he's so upset he goes out into the garden, and Esther is in the bedroom and in her house, and they're talking, and in the process, she falls down on the bed, and he falls down, and then the king walks in, and all of this ends up with Haman being hanged. It's so interesting to notice that he was then hanged. The king said, take him, and behold also the gallows that's 50 cubits high, which Haman had made for Mordecai. Hang him on that gallows. So they hanged Haman on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. So, again, people always ask me this question, what's providence? And I don't really have a real good answer because it's hard to answer the question. But I'm telling you this, if you can read this book, you can begin to get an idea of what providence is. Now, I'm not saying that we need to go out from here and every time something happens good to us, say, oh, that's the providence of God. I mean, You know, that's the mistake that people sometimes make, trying to read things into it. Now, you can have faith and confidence, say, I believe that God will watch over me, God will care for me, and whatever steps God takes, God will take. But you kind of have to have the attitude of Esther and say, if I perish, I perish. But at the same time, what you see in this is a real-time situation in which everything is tied together so carefully by God to bring about exactly what He wanted to happen. In chapter 8, in verse 8, we find that King Ahasuerus in verse 7 says to the king and to Mordecai, because now he's become involved in this too now, because he's been elevated to the position that Haman once held. He said, Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and him they have hanged on the gallows, because he has laid his hand upon the Jews. Write ye also for the Jews as it liketh you, in the king's name. Now remember, he's second in command now. Seal it with the king's ring. For the writing which is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's ring may no man reverse. Here's the problem they had. You know, you think of the wisdom of man. Man is so twisted in his thinking sometimes that he does things that really are not what he intends them to be. In this particular case, the Medes and the Persians had a law, and the law said that no law can ever be reversed. That once a law is passed, that it is then binding, and it cannot be reversed. He has told you that. So what the king is really saying to Mordecai and to Esther is, you know what? I gave Haman the right, and he issued a law, and he used my seal to seal it that said we're going to kill all the Jews. I can't reverse that. But, you know, there's usually a loophole to any law. But I can do something else. I can give you the right to issue a countermeasure that will have equal authority so that the Jews can be protected. And that's exactly what he did. And he wrote in the king Ahasuerus' name in verse 10 and sealed it with the king's ring and sent letters by post on horseback and riders on mules and camels and young dromedaries. In other words, speeded out the message to everywhere. Wherein the king granted the Jews which were in every city to gather themselves together. And to us that seems to be something that would always be a privilege, but that's not true. In a kingdom such as that, which was basically a dictatorship, you didn't have the right to gather together unless the king gave you the right, and he did here. And to stand for their life, to destroy, to slay, and to cause to perish all the power of the people in Providence that would assault them, both little ones and women, and to take the spoil of them for a prey. So exactly what he gave permission for Haman and his cohorts to do, he said to the Jews, you have a right to respond in kind. But they had one major thing in their favor. If you ever talk with anyone who is a student of military activities and maneuvers, the one thing that is very important always is the element of surprise. Now, this decree that Haman had written had been spread around and it had become common knowledge. Now, this decree that Mordecai wrote was a much different thing. Came out very late, was given only to the people that needed to know, as they sometimes say in military. So when these people rose up to slay the Jews, they found that they weren't slaying an innocent. It was kind of like, as I said, with the Germans in Warsaw in World War II. They got there, and they thought these Jews were going to be like all the rest of them. We'll put them on the cattle cars, carry them to the gas chamber, and we'll just gas them. It didn't happen. They were armed, they fought back, and they overthrew it. They actually overpowered the Germans in that particular situation and hung on to the rescue. Power of surprise. But again, think about it. Why was that decree ever written? That decree was written because the actions of Mordecai and the actions of Esther, because one was made the queen and one was made the second in command in the kingdom. And how was all that accomplished? No miraculous act, no direct action of God, but there was a web that was woven that was so tight-knit that every part of this story depends upon the part before. Now, it's interesting what happened in chapter 9, verse 2. The Jews were a relatively small nation in comparison to those surrounding them. They were still, even when they given the right to defend themselves, they were relatively small in comparison to the nation in which they had been carried captive. And so they still were in kind of a bad position. But what we find in chapter 9, verse 2, the Jews gathered themselves together, as God had said they could. All the rulers of the provinces, the lieutenants, the deputies, and the officers of the king helped the Jews. I mean, you know, they weren't people who were devoid of understanding. They looked and they said, hey, the king is involved on this side. So it behooves us to take a stand in that way. So it would seem that primarily the military in the country said, okay, we're going to assist the Jews. So again, you think about the providence of the God, how He brought about His will. There are only 3 verses in the 10th chapter. But when you look into the 10th chapter, you read this, and it's interesting to look at who actually, you know, this book is called Esther. And Esther is generally looked at as the real hero of the book, and she was. She was a hero of the book. But something people sometimes need to realize is this. If you look back to D-Day in World War II, for example, and you think of Dwight Eisenhower, who was the leader of the Allied forces, and you say he was the great hero that day. Well, he was. How many rifles did he fire? How many grenades did he throw? How many artillery pieces did he set off? How many missions did he fly on? None. Was it something he could have done by himself? No. I mean, when you begin to look at this situation, you do need to realize that Mordecai is a great part of this providential act of God, as well as Esther. She's not the only person here. In fact, it's interesting to notice that Esther is the one who is so instrumental, and yet I want you to look at these last 3 verses and think about what God said. And the king Ahasuerus laid a tribute upon the land, upon the isles of the sea, and all the acts of his power and of his might, and the declaration of the greatness of Mordecai, whereupon the king advanced him. Are they not written in the book of the chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was next unto King Ahasuerus, and great among the Jews, and accepted of the multitudes of his brethren, seeking the wealth of his people, and speaking peace to all his seed. He accomplished it. Now, next time somebody asks you about what is providence, we know it's a difficult question to answer. We know that describing and defining the providence of God is a hard thing to do. But, you remember I've used an illustration before about color? And I said, you know, if you have the color red and you're trying to explain it to someone who is totally blind, who had never seen it before, rather, you're trying to show it to someone who never seen red before, don't know what red is, you can tell them how many times light vibrates and that's red, and you can tell them it's the so-and-so color in the spectrum, and I can't remember which it is. But you can just get you a piece of paper and paint it red and say, there it is. I think sometimes if someone wants to know what the providence of God is, just sit down and make a good reading of the book of Esther. You may have a better idea. And it gives you comfort. You know, a lot of times in life, we look at situations that we think are very bleak and we can't get through. And I've said before, sometimes those situations that we get through, and a year from now we look back at them and we think, you know, that was just a minor blip on the radar screen, but it really seemed like something that was going to destroy me at that time. And we wonder how we ever got through it. Maybe then sometimes we need to go back and read the book of Esther. God doesn't always have a miraculous act where He comes down and parts the Red Sea. He doesn't always deal with us in a direct fashion where He actually speaks to us and explains the situation. Sometimes we just have to have the faith and the confidence. And looking at this book, I think will help you to have that faith and help you to have that confidence. Not been a first principle lesson, I understand that. But if you're here and you need to obey the gospel, we always give you that opportunity by repenting and being baptized for remission of sin. Certainly encourage you to do that as together we stand as we sing.